Am I framed up all right? Great. I do tend to move around. You'll notice that Kenya and I are both wearing our various nations' national uniform today, so it's nice for me to get dressed up. I once walked into a meeting, and I was wearing dark navy, and they all clapped and said, "We've never seen you in colour before." This is amazing. What's happened to you this week? Lovely to be here at St Stephen's again. I used to kind of play up here, and Kenya said, "Do you want to play a guitar?" And I was like, "No, get me away!" And I ran away. But I have some fantastic memories of being here, and lovely to see some of the old friends and old faces. But I'll make sure that's on. Is that going to go? Come, Lord Jesus. Is it going to work? Bonk. Almost. I'll turn it on. We said this was going to happen, didn't we? There we go. Great. When I was a teenager, I used to drive this old green car. That's me with a bowl cut. And it was a Datsun 1200, which is now worth a lot of money. Back then it was a bad car, and it's funny how some bad cars remain bad and other cars become very, very valuable, which I never would have imagined. And I got my mum to paint it up with all sorts of strange pictures, which you can see on there. It had painted flames coming off the back wheels, and there was a giant smiley face on the roof, and there were animals on the doors, and we called it the Datsun Special Vehicle. The DSV, here's another picture if I can get that to roll. You just click along for me, is that right? Yeah, go on, give me the next one. And that's us lying on it. I was in a band, and so that was a famous photo shoot. I'm sure you've seen on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. And the upside of owning such a recognisable car was that it made the driver a local celebrity. So that was very good. The downside of driving such a car was it made the driver a local celebrity to the police. We never say the local driver might be trying to sneak home after 10 o'clock on a restricted licence. It was very hard to fly under the radar when you're driving a car like that. Well, go to the next slide. When I was 18, and I was now on my full licence, rest assured, and I just finished a very late gig with my band in Nelson, I was driving the Datsun Special Vehicle around Rocks Road, just around there. And I was on my way home to Wakefield, where I was staying with my folks, and it was a particularly dark night, very, very dark, and it was strangely quiet on the roads. But what made it even more unusual was that there had been a heavy fog that had rolled in from the sea all along Rocks Road, and it was this kind of thick, very thick, swirling fog, which I'd never seen before in Nelson. Maybe you see it a lot. I hadn't seen that before. I'd seen it in Christchurch. I hadn't seen it rolling in Nelson before. And so as you can imagine, late at night, I was alone, quiet, it's foggy, there's the gentle hum of the DSV. It all felt very spooky. It actually felt quite spooky. And I had to wind down my windows, which weren't electric, to see better, and all I could hear was the crashing waves. I couldn't see them because it was just sort of soupy out there. I couldn't see any other cars coming, and it's just quiet, and I'm just cruising along, hoping I'm on the right side of the road, assuming I'm probably on the right side of the road. Or the left. Thank you, Jamie. And as I come to right out here to the Tahuna Township, I get to a roundabout, which was there before there were lights. And as I stop at the roundabout, I look up to check for any oncoming traffic, and I see one of the most shocking things that I have ever experienced. And my mouth opens. My heart feels like it stops beating in my chest. My breathing stops, and I can't believe my eyes. It's probably the only time in my life where I can't believe my eyes. And it's like time has stood still. And that's because hovering about 50 metres in front of me is one of these here. There is a UFO hovering It's always a very interesting reaction from people when I share this story. It feels like I'm explaining the resurrection to the disciples. There's a UFO hovering in front of me, and its lights are kind of shining out from the undercarriage, sort of, maybe it's 5 meters round or something like that, and it's just floating there, surrounded by fog, and its beams of light are sort of just coming out the bottom of it, dispersing through the haze. And it's sort of like I've stumbled into a scene from War of the Worlds, if you remember that whole kind of movie, and it's there. And up until that moment, I wasn't really someone, I was quite agnostic on UFOs. I was neither into them nor not. I mean, I loved reading about them as a kid. I don't know that I really thought they existed, like you would drive through Tahuna and that you go, oh, God, there it is. You know, so I was just utterly shocked. And it's amazing how fast your beliefs change when you're faced with a floating, shining disc in front of you. You go, I've got to reconsider what I believe. What is this in front of me? And I'm just so scared. I just remember I was just so scared. I was petrified. I could feel adrenaline pumping into my bloodstream. And I remember I just freeze. I'm just sitting in my car. My mouth is open. I'm trying to comprehend what I'm seeing. I'm trying to work out what I should do next. And here's the first thought that comes to my mind. This explains why the roads are so quiet. They have been beamed up. They've been abducted, you see. And do you know the second thought that comes to my mind is, I'm next. I'm next. I've got to get out of here. I've got to work out what I'm going to do. How will I be? I've got to get out before I'm spotted. And so maybe 5 or 10 seconds pass. I'm frozen, sitting there, trying to make sense of the scene in front of me, trying to work out my next move. And then a gentle wisp of wind blows down the valley over the spot where the UFO is hovering. And I begin to breathe again. I feel my heart rate slowing down. Because as the fog is blown away, the true identity of the UFO is revealed. And it's this. It is the, now gone sadly, a lot of us would be sad about this, the famous Tahunanui KFC bucket. And what had happened was, it still had its giant lights which would shine out the bottom of the bucket, but the fog had hidden the Colonel and his red stripes. And so, you know, I'd been fully aware that KFC could give you a heart attack, but I wasn't aware, this is a whole different take on it. And it was amazing in those moments, I genuinely thought, I'm seeing a UFO and I don't know what to do here. And it was so scary. Funny now, you know what I mean? It looks back as funny because it's KFC bucket. It's very funny. And I can see whenever I share that story, I love looking at Kenua's face, and he's going, this sermon is taking a direction I'm very uncomfortable with. And how am I going to remove him before this kind of moves on? But what I find so interesting about that story is it's amazing how when we find ourselves in confusing, uncertain situations, it can really mess with the way we see and perceive things. And it can mess with the way, even the things we think we know well. Like, I knew that KFC bucket was there. It was a thing of great adoration in my family. I knew it was there, and yet I'd forgotten when under these changed circumstances and in this kind of stress. When we're under stress, we can start to freak out, we can lose our way, and we can focus on the wrong things, and we can jump to some very strange conclusions about what's going on around us. And that's quite natural, that when we're under pressure and stress like that, that would happen. The fog of the world and our fears of the world can sometimes really mess with the way that we perceive things. When we're scared and when it's foggy, we can sometimes jump to the wrong conclusions about what's happening around us. Well, this morning I've been asked to come and speak as part of your stories exploring the I am statements of Jesus. I believe Jesus is the most important person who ever walked the earth, and who Jesus says he is really changes who I am, and it changes who you are. It's not just about him, who he says he is, really impacts how I understand who I am and how I should live my life. It's profound. That's why we spend so much time trying to understand what he's getting at. What does it mean when he says these statements? Who did he think he was? And so this morning, it was lovely to hear our gospel reading. Thank you. Comes from John 8 and also references John 9. And I'll go to the next slide, thanks. Where Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And John 9 picks this up later on in John. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So Jesus is repeating this idea. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue. This is a real idea he is wanting to communicate. And light is a common theme of God's presence and guidance in the world throughout Scripture. If we look at the next one, we see Exodus. That the Lord guided the Israelites by night by a pillar of fire to give them light so they could travel. I'm not sure this is what it looks like. It's not a photo, but it's an attempt to say what would it look like to be in that space. And the next one there, we have the very first words of God in Genesis 1 says, "Let there be light." There's a common theme going through Scripture over the place of light being God's presence and guidance. And then the next one, the opening words of John's Gospel. So our reading's from John's Gospel, but this is the opening lines. And what the writer of John's Gospel is doing is he's calling back to the first words of Genesis, and he's sort of restating it again about Jesus. These are just amazing words. He says, in the beginning was the Word, which is Christ. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and that life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So John is sort of calling back to Genesis, and he's saying this, that this light of Jesus, whom we're about to meet in the rest of the gospel, he is the one that will bring spiritual life, spiritual light, and it's just as significant as the light that was created by God the Father at the beginning of creation to give physical light. He's saying that what you know about in Genesis, this is just as significant, what I'm going to tell you. And John's interesting because the other Gospels, you meet Jesus as a baby and he grows up. John just goes straight for the jugular. This is Christ. Through all things he was made. This is the guy, this is the Logos, this is everything that holds the universe together. And I think that's because the audience were Greek and they're quite impressed by that. They like those sorts of understandings. So next slide, thanks. In our passage today, finally though, Jesus himself makes this claim. John makes it at the start of the gospel, but we get to the story where Jesus himself says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And he's sharing this with the people in Jerusalem, and also the Pharisees are there. It's a pretty common setting that we see going on. Jesus trying to communicate who he is to the people, and the Pharisees are sort of butting in, uncertain what to do with Jesus. How do we shut this down? And imagine for a moment that you are the Pharisees hearing him say, I am the light of the world. And I think it's probably a bit like the faces I saw when I shared about the UFO. There's a sense of, are you for real? Is this what you're really saying? What are you saying, Jesus? Are you claiming to be the Messiah? Are you even claiming to be some sort of equal with God? What is this man saying when he says these things? And so upon hearing this claim of being the light to the world, the Pharisees challenge Jesus, which is fair enough, and they say, well, who can bear witness to this pretty big claim? Who's your backup? You can't just go around saying things like this. Who's a person that's going to say, yeah, we stand behind Jesus, he is the light of the world? And it appears that Jesus has come to the conclusion that these religious leaders have a very dim and distorted idea about what God the Father is really like. And Jesus' challenge in response to their question is basically to say this: if you really knew what God was like, you'd recognize that in me, you're seeing the same God standing right before you. And Jesus is essentially saying to them, you clearly don't really know in your hearts much about the God whom you can't see, because here I am, I'm God's son, I share my Father's DNA, and I'm standing right here before you in the flesh, and you don't recognize me. Does that make sense? That's his thing. And so one way to think of it, and I hope this isn't too dangerous of an analogy, but this is to play with light. And it's one way when I worked as a university chaplain and I had to defend Jesus quite a lot over what was going on with Jesus. And one little way I sometimes have explained it, I'd say we might think of the image we're given of God in the Old Testament as being like a painting, but maybe it's hanging in a dimly lit gallery. And you can make out lots of parts around who God is quite clearly, but there are other parts of his character and his personality and his heart that remain still a bit foggy, still hard to work out. But then in the New Testament, when Jesus comes onto the scene, it's as if someone has switched all of the gallery lights on full, and the details of the painting have come into high resolution. And it's not a different picture of God that we see in Jesus, it's the same painting. But now we see God's character and heart with even more clarity in the face of the light of Jesus. That's sort of one of the ways that I try to kind of think of it. That's why Jesus is quite important, because there's a lot of questions over what is God like? What's he like? It's like you go and meet Jesus and you discover what God is like. And some of it's quite surprising. The things that God is concerned about is quite surprising. That's why the Pharisees got worked up, because they were trying to reconcile the kind of God that they understood with who they were encountering in the person of Jesus, the true God. So the key question for this morning I want to explore is this. What does Jesus' claim that I am the light of the world mean for you? How does Jesus' claim that he offers the light of life impact who you are and how you live your life today and right now? And there are lots of things that can be said. And I've heard lots of sermons about Jesus being the light of the world and all sorts of strangely used metaphors. There's a lot of light out there, and it sort of becomes free game to grab any example of light and sort of shoehorn it around this way and that. But I felt really drawn to this question around two ways that the light of Jesus might change the way that we live in the world as we face the challenges of 2022. Because I think Jesus being the light has a lot to teach us right now in this year as we face some of the things we face. And there's 2 points I want to make. Firstly, Christians know that the world is a place full of darkness. We're not surprised by that. We know that's the case. We just look at the news. Here's some examples of the news, if you pop those up there. We look and we see Ukraine, we see COVID, we see the tension of protests, we see historical abuse in the church. There's so many aspects of things going on where we know there's darkness. And many people in our community feel overwhelmed by the darkness of the world. And that's quite a sane response, actually, to the darkness of the world. And plenty of people I've met even think this darkness is so overwhelming and so pervasive that it almost disproves God's existence. They say, how could a good God allow such darkness to persist? They say that to me. But Jesus' claim here is not that his light will instantly flood all corners of the world and remove all darkness instantly. Rather, in a world which is often dark, I don't want to say it's always dark. One part of me wants to defend that the world is good, you see. But hear me, I'm being careful. In a world that is often dark, and a world that is not yet restored and renewed, so that the final creation has not been consummated, Jesus is the one true light that shines in the darkness. Jesus is the shining light that gives us hope for the future of the world and clarity on how to live despite the darkness. even when things feel chaotic and they feel grim. So Christians are those strange people who worship Jesus as the light of the world, and we believe that the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. That's what Christians believe. Not that there isn't darkness, but that there is a light in the world and that light won't get snuffed out. So yes, the world can be dark, but in Jesus we realise that the darkness won't get the last word. And so we are people of radical hope, on one hand, who aren't surprised that darkness exists. I hope that makes sense. And that we try to hold those things in tension, but that darkness won't win. I'll take you on to the next slide, if that's all right. And I was unsure if I should mention this, but I'm going to because I'm a guest preacher and then I run away. But secondly, we live in a time when it seems to me many Christians are spending more time contemplating the dark mysteries of the world and less time living into the light of Jesus. And people are constantly chattering about whatever. You can project onto me, your enemy, and so I can be in your corner. So I don't, whatever. But they are chattering about whether it's conspiracies or government agendas. And personally, I've found it sad to discover how susceptible Christians are to dark gossip. It feels like the same vein that our faith runs up can be co-opted by all sort of weird things that sort of flow up there as well. And as we scroll on Facebook or listen to the radio, it's so easy to get sucked into the wild speculations and the sort of paranoid obsessions as we attempt to understand the darkness of the world. Because we're trying to understand it. Why is the world so dark and how can we understand this? We can easily discover that one day we are spending more time feeling confused by the darkness of the world rather than being guided by the light of Christ. And in these more chaotic, foggy times, it's easy to find ourselves focusing on almost like spiritual junk food, on all the dark things, everything that's wrong, becoming panicked, rather than making sure we're eating the stuff that brings us life, being Jesus and his light. Very easy to have happen, right? It's very easy. It happens to me. Very easy to have that happen. Now, hear me right. I do think it's true. The world is full of nasty, powerful people committed to skullduggery and propaganda. So I'm not saying that's not true. That's totally true. And our chatter about these things actually feels so good because it gives us a sense of control in a world that feels out of control. That's why we do it. It's very satisfying. I love getting together with my friends and saying, well, I read that this happened. Of course, I can't back it up, but doesn't that make me feel good? I feel like I'm getting some understanding of something that's not understandable. And we need to be aware of the way that the darkness manifests in the world. We shouldn't be naive about that as Christians. But I'm not sure, and this is me saying this, I'm not sure if Jesus was here, that is the kind of stuff that he would want his followers to put most of our energy and most of our conversations into, because it takes up a huge amount of energy and it's not healthy. And we end up feeling worse about hanging out together rather than better and more empowered. Because in many ways, the Pharisees, I like the Pharisees, they're doing their best. But they did get it wrong, and Jesus was quite harsh on them. Sometimes I'm like, calm down, at least they were trying. But they were guilty of sort of a similar preoccupation. They'd spent most of their energy focusing on elaborate ways of understanding God and trying to name and control the world and the people around them. They'd fallen into that habit of trying to get control over the world. They were so distracted by all of that stuff, they couldn't even recognize God's own Son and Messiah standing right in front of them, because they'd spent all their energy misunderstanding God's heart, or they'd missed the point. So what does it mean for us to focus on the light of Jesus rather than the darkness of the world in 2022? Because what you think the light might be and what I think might be quite different. So we both think we're focusing on the light, but actually what does it mean to do that? And I want to go to this next slide, if that's all right. I want to suggest that a big part of it, and this has been a big part for me, don't find it very easy, is to come to the realization that in the light of Jesus, we actually have real clarity over what God is like and what God cares about. We're no longer groping around, reaching in the dark, wondering how God would like us to live our lives. The light of Jesus gives us clarity in dark times, brings us clarity in foggy times. And I want to suggest that what if we focused on what we knew rather than what we didn't know? So I believe that Jesus, the light of the world, invites us to not get lost down weird, dark rabbit holes and obsessions that take up all of our energy, as fun as that is, as much as that's quite satisfying and a good time, but to instead focus on the simple things of God's kingdom that have been revealed with the greatest of clarity in the face of Jesus. So I want to say, what if we were to focus on what we did know rather than on the huge amount of stuff that we don't know? And that's what a light in the darkness is. It acknowledges there's a lot of dark, but where is the light? What does it mean to step and focus towards the light? And so what has the light of Jesus revealed to us in the dark world? That's an interesting thing for you to think about. I came up with a little list of what do I know rather than what I don't know in terms of how I might live out in this dark world. And here's some things. Well, love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul and strength. I thought, well, that's clear. That's quite clear. Another one was, love our neighbours as ourselves. That's actually quite clear. See, there's no argument in the room about that. That's what Jesus laid out. That's what that looks like. Next one is, forgive others just as the Father has forgiven us. That's quite hard. But it's clear. You see, it's clear that that's what it might look like to step towards the light in a dark world where forgiveness is not common and where people are trying to seek retribution. I've heard some Christians say some terrible things over, say, what might happen to Putin or to Putin's family, or, and it slips out. The darkness overcomes and it slips out. And yet, Jesus says, forgive others as our Father has forgiven us. Next one, we should be generous towards others just as the Father is generous to us. That's clear. It's just hard. It's easier to chatter. Living into this is quite hard. And we shouldn't judge others lest the Father judges us. That's clear. We should care for the poor. Jesus was quite clear on that. And lastly, if all else fails, we can pray. That's not a bad idea. Do you know what I mean? That's just not a bad idea. Now, I know you look at this and say, well, this is dumb. It's so simple. But it's like, well, it's not simple, is it? Well, it is. It's simple. It's just incredibly hard. And no wonder we'd rather talk and talk about the weirdest thing we just saw and various things, because living into this is hard, but it's the light of the world. I think this should give us plenty to get stuck into. I reckon if you get all that done, then you can, in your spare time, get right into whatever weird theories you want to. Just get this sorted out first, and then you can get started. And it's so, yes, the world is complicated, and doing those things is not easy. Forgiving someone is very hard. It's not just hard, it's complicated. But there's also a sense of the good news being shockingly simple. That Jesus loves us, came and walked amongst us, died for us, and invites us to lean into those same things. I mean, it's quite simple, it's just hard. This is the God that we discover in the light of the world, Jesus Christ. This God that loved us so much that he was willing to enter into a complicated, dark world so that the light of his love would shine in the mess and the dirt of our reality. And get this, the mess and the dirt of your reality, of what you go home to and how messy that is. That's where the light of the world is present. And I want to share with you in the words of Mark Strom, this God could put on eyebrows and kneecaps, tear ducts and saliva glands. This God could be born under the tyrants Augustus and Herod. This God could accept the smells of shepherds and the extravagancies of political emissaries. This God could start a life of vulnerable, hunted child born into scandal. This God could grow up under foreign domination and among terrorists and outcasts. This God could sit in the street playing marbles. This God could wear with pride the callous, splintered hands of an honest workman, building the houses and fixing the furniture of half-castes, outcasts and bigots. This God could ask his cousin to baptise him along with the rest of the crowd. This God could make the best vintage Pinot Noir or Chardonnay even when the guests were too drunk to know the difference. This God could befriend a bloke in a tree with small man syndrome. This God could enjoy a woman of questionable character washing his feet, giving her his full and undivided attention and ignoring the eye-rolling of lawyers and theologians. This God could spend a whole night making a whip to crack over the backs of con artists who rip off the poor. This God could wrap the greatest truths in the simplest stories and put a sting in the tail of every yarn. This God could let himself hang on a tree, nails tearing at his sinews, blood, feces and urine running down his legs. This God could invite women to be the first to know that he was back. This God could delay his own glorious homecoming long enough for a bite of breakfast on a beach and a yarn with an old mate to let him know that there were no hard feelings and to pass on his mantle. This God could take his own story and give it the most surprising ending. This God is worth knowing. This God could reach into the crevices of my soul to bring to life the longings I smother so pathetically and recklessly with shame and excuses. This God could raise me up to life with him. This God could give me every blessing he could give himself. This God could draw me out of my petty self-interest without a hint of a tut-tut or a frown or a patronising smile. This God could be more infuriating and fascinating and gobsmacking than any God I could ever make up. This God could love my obsessiveness and overlook my forgetfulness. This God could laugh and cry with me and come play with me. This God could make me his glory. This God could love me. This God could make my heart good. This God could trust me. This God could never be safe, but always be good. This God is worth knowing. This God I want to know. This God I know in the light and in the face and in the spirit of Jesus. Amen.